This is going to start us out in the digestion and nutrition chapter, and the first question that you have in this chapter is, what is Helicobacter pylori, or what's it been implicated in, and how can you treat it? So what it's been implicated in is gastric ulcers, which are little bleeding sores that people can get inside their stomach. It used to be believed that you only got that when you were stressed out, and so it was believed that stress actually caused the condition. As it turns out, though, what happens is you get this bacteria that grows in your stomach. When you get stressed, your immune system gets weakened. That allows the bacteria to overgrow, and then they sort of start to eat away at the mucus lining of the stomach. Because the mucus goes away, it allows the stomach acid to actually digest the stomach. And so an ulcer is sort of a person digesting their own stomach, which you can imagine is very painful. Now that we know that it's caused by this species of bacteria, this condition is now treated with antibiotics. In the past, it was always just sort of take some antacids and try to reduce your stress levels. We still want people to do those things if they have Helicobacter. We just now can also add the antibiotic to try to kill the bacteria off. After that, we're going to take a step back and just talk about some terms that have popped up every now and then. So heterotrophs are substances or organisms, I should say, that have to eat or absorb nutrients because they can't make them for themselves. So we are heterotrophic. Fungi are heterotrophic. Some species of bacteria are heterotrophic. Autotrophs are organisms that can make their own food. So that would be like plants. Again, some species of bacteria, some algae, they're autotrophic. And so this is sort of a plants versus animals thing in this set of terms. Nutrients are molecules that you need or elements that you need that you really can't make for yourself. We've got macronutrients and then we have micronutrients. Your macronutrients are things like carbohydrates, proteins, lipids. We're going to talk about those here in just a minute. Your micronutrients are things like vitamins and minerals that you need in much lower quantities. The nutrients that you get them from the foods that you eat, and depending on what you're drinking, you get them from the things that you drink as well. Eating foods that are fresh supplies you with more nutrients at a lower calorie intake. Foods that are more processed, in other words, they come in cans or boxes, they tend to have more nutrients, but also, well, depends on, they might have more nutrients, they might not, it depends on the product, but they're going to tend to have way more calories in them than foods that are fresher. Nutrients contain two important resources. What are they? Number 1 and 2 here, just pause the video to get what you need. Basically, it's energy and chemicals. That's what you get from your food. Here's where we're going to come back and review something. This is usually discussed in Bio 1, but everybody's either forgotten it because, you know, PTSD makes you block out all the chemistry stuff, or maybe you didn't even take the first semester of biology. So to start off with carbohydrates. Generally speaking, when you eat carbs, you're eating molecules that are large molecules. And pardon me, I got to get my little pen turned on. Here we go. And so when you eat them, you're eating these molecules, and they tend to form ring structures. The individual parts do. But complex carbs have, I don't know why I'm fritzing out there, lots of smaller building blocks to them. So this could be like a molecule of starch, for example. And so I'll go ahead and put that on really messily as always. What we have to do when you eat starch and say rice or bread or corn, something like that, is we have to be able to break the bonds between those because you can't absorb the starch you eat. It's too big a molecule. You have to break it down into smaller components. So we make enzymes to help us break the bonds. And when we do that, we release simple sugars, which are called monosaccharides. Last semester when I gave examples of monosaccharides, that would be like glucose. There's a bunch of other ones too. Monosaccharides are what your cells can use best as an energy source. It's what your digestive system can absorb well as is because they're smaller molecules. So we tend to eat polysaccharides. We have to digest those down into monosaccharides because those are small enough molecules that we can actually absorb them. All right, I'm going to change colors to talk about the next one. Next up is proteins. Proteins are made out of amino acids. So when you eat a protein, It's a chain of a bunch of amino acids that are bonded together with covalent bonds. I'm just drawing random shapes. Amino acids have actually very complex shapes that I'm not going to get into. So I'm just kind of picking some random things that I can draw, apparently based on elementary school things. Okay, so this is an unfolded protein. An unfolded protein is called a polypeptide. Once again, giant molecule. You can't absorb that as is. So we have to have enzymes that can break this apart and then release the individual amino acids that build it up. And once again, we talked about this in a lot of detail last semester because we talked about protein synthesis even when we were talking about DNA and how DNA gets used in the body and it codes for proteins. So in order to read DNA, we read it and then it tells us which amino acid to put in there next so that we can build a polypeptide. So we hit that in a fair amount of detail last semester. All right, let me erase all that ink and then I'll start on the next one. What color do I want? I guess green. I haven't done green yet. Okay, lipids. Most of the lipids that you eat are in these molecules that are called triglycerides. Triglycerides are also known as neutral fats because they are nonpolar. They consist of a glycerol backbone, and then attached to that, we have 3 fatty acid tails. Those fatty acid tails can either be saturated or unsaturated. They can be cis or trans if they are unsaturated. Basically, when we eat a triglyceride, what we're going to do is enzymatically break off the fatty acid tails from the glycerol, and then we can use either of those as an energy source. Last up. Now, this last one, we don't get calories from consuming it, but it is still something that we consume, because if you're eating something that used to be alive, whether it's plant or animals, it's going to have DNA inside of it. Well, DNA and RNA, those are nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are strings of, and I'm going to even suck harder at drawing this one. We got a pentose sugar attached to a phosphate, and then we have some type of nitrogen-containing base. These end up being all attached to each other so that you get strings of them put together. And then there could be more of those down there. That would repeat over and over again down there. What we can do is break this apart and then release the nucleotide. Then we can use that nucleotide to build up our own DNA and RNA inside of our body. So even though we don't get calories from nucleic acids, we still eat them and we can still reuse some of the components of them. So that's a refresher, and the reason why it's coming back now is your food supplies you with these things and you need them as fuel sources, and so you can build hormones, and so you can have an immune system, and all these other reasons. The way you get them is through the food you eat. All right. I think I made this PowerPoint so long ago. It was back when I was still watching The Walking Dead before it sucked, but that's okay. So that's why I was in a zombie sort of mood as I was making this, I guess. 4 stages of food processing. Step 1 is what's happening in the picture. It's called ingestion. You could boil it down to simply put the food in your mouth. Step 2, digestion. Digestion happens 2 ways. We can mechanically break down food, which means we physically tear it apart. That's like chewing is a good example of mechanical digestion. Or there's also chemical digestion, and that uses enzymes to chemically break apart our food from those big molecules down to smaller molecules. Both of those 2 processes are necessary in order for you to completely process your food. Step 3. Once you have digested down into small enough molecules, step 3 is absorption of those nutrients. So technically, the food that's in your stomach is outside of your body. It's not in your body until it passes through a membrane. Absorption allows that passage through a membrane, and it gets your nutrients actually into your bloodstream. Step 4 is elimination or defecation or removal of waste, excretion, whichever one you want to call that. But anything that you can't absorb, it slides out, is how we'll say that nicely. And so that's the removal of that waste from your body in the form of solid waste, hopefully. All right. So the waste that you remove this way, it's called feces. What is it? It's undigested or unabsorbable nutrients like fiber. It's dead cells that have sloughed off of your GI system. It's bacteria, both dead and alive, that live in your intestines. It can have some other things in it, but the only other thing that's in there in high quantities is really water. The longer your feces stays inside your large intestine, the more water you absorb from that feces. And so that can lead to constipation. The longer you go in between bowel movements, the more likely it is that you're absorbing that water out, which then also increases the risk of constipation. It becomes this positive feedback cycle. This is a real thing, the Bristol stool chart. If you ever have to be in a long-term care facility, nurses' aides will go around and ask you, have you had your BM today? Which means bowel movement. And then if they're doing a really good job and they're not short-staffed, they'll even ask you, what's the consistency of your BM today? Because they want to know if you have diarrhea. If you do, that means we need to increase your water intake so that you don't end up becoming dehydrated. If it does end up looking like deer pellets, like this type 1, well, that means you're constipated. Maybe we need to up your water intake so that you can help pass your stool faster. Not because of dehydration, but just because we're absorbing the water out of the feces. We might want to give you stool softeners. We might even have to give you laxatives if that's the case. And so this is something that really gets asked. So I do always ask in class, like, where would you sit? That said, I don't want you guys to tell me, like, oh, I had a type 4 today. It was fantastic. Like, that's TMI. I don't need to know. But I do want you to just look at this and think about, where were you for your last bowel movement? Were you more at the type 4, which is supposed to be like a fantastic way to go? Or were you more towards type 1? You need to eat more fiber and drink more and exercise, believe it or not, that does help. Or were you more towards the type 7, in which case I hope you didn't leave the house today, because that is diarrhea that probably also gets associated with cramping. Okay, once again, backing up to just some terms. Herbivores are things that eat exclusively plant material. Everything that's on, as I'm looking at the TV screen anyway, the left side of the screen, these are all herbivores. The iguana is also an insectivore, so he's not really a strict herbivore, but the rest of those are pretty much strict herbivores. Carnivores eat meat. So this heron that's eating a snake, carnivore. Technically, the iguana could go in there too, because a lot of iguanas don't just eat fruit and flowers, they also eat insects, and insects are technically meat, and so again, it could kind of go in both of those two places. Some other terms that can happen in the rest of the animal kingdom. So detritivores eat dead, decaying matter. So one of the ways that taxidermists can clean up skeletal remains so that people can mount a skull is they use these special beetles called dermestid beetles. The dermestid beetles eat all tissue off of that skull, and it looks super clean when they're done with it. So dermestid beetles are detritivores. Omnivores are what most people are. It means you eat a little bit of everything. You eat some plants, you eat some animals. Technically, we do eat dead, decaying stuff too, because I bet you're not eating from a live cow when you eat your hamburgers or something. So I know we don't like to think of ourselves that way, but that is really where we kind of sit. All right, feeding strategies. Bulk feeders eat big meals and then can go a fairly long time without eating another meal. So yeah, if this fish, well, not fish, if this bird is successful at eating this fish, it won't have to eat again for a little bit. Snakes are also really good bulk feeders. If you have a pet snake, very often you'll only have to feed your snake like 3 times a year, depending on the size of the thing you're feeding it. And so, yeah, they're bulk feeders. Fluid feeders are pretty self-explanatory. They eat liquid meals. So I'm showing you a female mosquito. They eat blood. That is a fluid feeding. Suspension feeders are also called filter feeders. The reason that you can use either of these two names, suspension feeder is because they're eating food suspended in water. Filter feeding is because they're filtering that suspended material out of the water. So the largest animal on the planet actually happens to be a filter feeder or suspension feeder. It uses baleen to filter krill out of the water, and then it eats that krill. There are also smaller things that fit into this group. This is sometimes called a Christmas tree worm. It's a type of polychaete. It filters much smaller material out of the water with these little almost leg-like things, and then it eats that material that way. Substrate feeders eat what they live on. So to give you a weird, grim fairy tale story, like if Hansel and Gretel lived in a gingerbread house and ate that house, that would make them substrate feeders. In this case, we have the larva of some kind of beetle that is living inside of a leaf, and it's eating the leaf as it goes through, and you can see it pooping its waste out on the flip side. So it's eating the leaf it lives in. deposit feeders eat dirt, and so this would be an earthworm. It's the classic example of a deposit feeder. What is an alimentary canal, and which organs make it up in humans? So what is it? It's the tube that food travels through as it goes through your body. So it's also called the GI tract, which is gastrointestinal tract. The organs that make it up in humans, I'll start at the top and we'll work our way down. Mouth is usually where we start. When we swallow, we push the food to the pharynx, which is also part of the respiratory system. From there, we go to the esophagus, which is just digestive system. It's not shared with any other organ systems. That takes us to the stomach. Stomach takes us to the small intestine. Small intestine takes us to the large intestine. Large intestine takes us to the rectum and then out through the anus. So that's the tube the food actually travels through, or the alimentary canal. After that, you have this picture to label. Make sure you get all the labels again. You can pause the video to get what you need, but I'll kind of run you through it. So, mouth, tongue, lips, all of that stuff, including the salivary glands up there. Once you've ingested the food, we start the process of mechanical and chemical digestion within the mouth. Most of the mechanical stuff is happening with the teeth, but honestly, the lips and the cheeks are going to play a role, and your tongue plays a pretty big role in that as well. The salivary glands release saliva into the mouth. There's a lot of different chemicals in saliva, but most importantly for our purposes, there's an enzyme called salivary amylase, and it helps us digest starch. So we start the process of digesting starch in the mouth. When we swallow, the food next goes to the pharynx, which normal people call the throat. There's not really a lot that happens in the pharynx aside from it passes through there. Same with the esophagus. Food passes through there fairly quickly. And then takes us to the stomach. I'm going to pause for a second and deal with my dog. Okay, so I think I had just made it off to the stomach. Stomach starts us off again with chemical digestion. We start to release more enzymes that we hadn't had before. We also have these muscle contractions that happen within the stomach. Those help to churn the food up and mix it together really well. Stomach is also, if you eat a big meal, it's very stretchy and it can store that food for a long time. Once our food has been mixed and it's soupy enough, then we're going to enter the small intestine, which is actually very long. It's about 20-ish feet long. It is where most of our absorption is going to happen, and it's where most of our chemical digestion is going to happen. Next, the food is going to enter the large intestine, which is also known as the colon. This is where we have a bunch of bacteria that live that help us process some of our nutrients, primes our immune system. We can also store some feces in there until we're ready to release it. Now, one of the things that the GI tract is really good at is having these valves or doors, which are called sphincter muscles. They control when food gets to move forward and when it has to stay where it is. There is a sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach. It's called the cardiac sphincter. If that one fails, stomach acid actually will back up into the esophagus. That's what leads to reflux or gastroesophageal reflux disease. At the other end of the stomach, we have the pyloric sphincter. That's what makes sure that our food is nice and soupy before we let it leave the stomach and go to the small intestine. Next, peristalsis. This is the rhythmic wave of muscle contractions. It's going to push food through the digestive system. It's a characteristic of smooth muscle. So the way the muscle is arranged is there's muscle that goes around the tube, and then there's muscle that goes down the length of the tube. What happens during peristalsis is during one contraction, the circular muscle contracts, and during the other one, the longitudinal muscle contracts. That action helps to mix food, and it helps to make sure food's always moving forward through the system. Now, this is something that's always happening in you. You don't normally get to see it, though. In the video that I'm going to show you, this dude had been in a motorcycle accident. He has a thin graft in place right now, and so you can see a lot of the organs in his abdomen. And I specifically want to show you one little section. So he's recording from his head and he's looking down his body. You'll see
sliced all the way up.
I'm actually going to stop that. Hold on, I'll come back farther. You'll see like it looks kind of creepily like worms moving. That's his intestines pushing the food through there.
What his stomach looks like.
Yeah, I kind of like this dude because he likes to play with his graft, but anyway, so all of those little wiggly movements that you see all through there, like right through there, that's peristalsis that's happening. And like I said, it happens all the time. You just don't usually get to see it like that. Okay. Next up, sphincters. Mentioned those earlier. These are the valves that control when food gets to move forward and when it stays in one place. They're a little ring of circular smooth muscle, so they constrict and that closes the valve, or it relaxes, that opens the valve. I'm going to pause again for my dogs. All right, I'm going to see if I can make it through the rest of this with no interruptions. Wish me luck. Okay, function for the teeth. It's a fancy process called mastication. Mastication really just means chewing, and so its real function is mechanical digestion. It's physically tearing up your food. The tongue does a couple of things in relation to the digestive system. One, it helps with taste, which is pretty important for enjoying food and then wanting to eat more of it. It also helps to shape food in your mouth into something called a bolus, which is a round and mass of food. I don't know if you've ever swallowed food before you made it to that point, but it ends up being pretty difficult to do that. So your tongue is really helping to shape the food to help you swallow it better. Pharynx is the throat. It's really just a passageway for food, just like it was a passageway for air. Epiglottis is the guardian of the airway. We talked about that a little bit in the respiratory system. When you are swallowing food, the epiglottis pulls down and it covers up and hits the wall between the trachea to the front and the esophagus to the back. By doing that, it makes sure that the food has to stay in the esophagus and then it doesn't get into the trachea. So it's really trying to make sure you don't swallow food down the wrong pipe. The esophagus is just a passageway for food. The A&P textbook says that food spends about 8 to 10 seconds in the esophagus, so it really doesn't take all that long to pass through. Your weird little factoid for the day is, while gravity can help the esophagus speed that up, you don't need gravity to work. In fact, if you were to stand on your head, you could still swallow food and then get it up to the stomach against gravity because of the smooth muscle that's contracting to push it down. So gravity helps, but it's not necessary, which is really handy for astronauts. Gastric juice. It's a set of secretions from the stomach. It includes stomach acid, mucus, and then some enzymes produced by the stomach. If you have ever been unfortunate enough to have one of those nice little stomach bugs where you've been throwing up all day, there comes a point where everybody says they're throwing up bile. You're not really throwing up bile. Bile is a whole other chemical. What you're throwing up at that point is the gastric juice that is secreted by the stomach. Okay, pepsin. It is a digestive enzyme released by the stomach, and it helps you digest proteins. Chyme is gastric juice plus food. So if you just ate and then you threw up, what you threw up was chyme. If you've been throwing up for a while and you haven't eaten, then what you throw up is a gastric juice. Small intestine. Passageway for food, yes, but what I want you to know is 90% of absorption happens in the small intestine, and the majority of our chemical digestion happens in the small intestine too. The pancreas. It is an organ that belongs in both the endocrine system because it releases hormones that helps us regulate blood sugar. And it belongs in the digestive system because it releases enzymes that help us digest all of our different categories of nutrients. So it's one organ that plays a very important role in maintaining blood levels of specific nutrients through digestion and through hormone action. Bile is an oily, salty liquid that's produced by the liver. It's actually really a salt, but it's mixed up in some stuff. Bile ends up working very much like your phospholipids do. So if you remember phospholipids, they have a polar end and a non-polar end. That means it's a molecule that both loves water and hates water. Bile is the same way. What'll happen is if you mix bile together with fat, the tails will grab into the fat and then the heads can mix with the water. That's because most of the food that you're eating is hydrophilic and it will mix with water, okay? The lipids won't though. That's problematic for your digestive system because if it won't mix in, you can't digest it very well. So what I want you to know also about bile is it emulsifies fat. What that means is it'll take a big fat droplet like this and pull it into smaller droplets that will mix with water. That's what emulsification means. Liver is the organ that makes the bile. It also helps to process and store nutrients. Gallbladder is the organ that stores bile and releases it when you need it. So again, the liver makes the bile and then sends it to the gallbladder. The gallbladder stores it, and let's say you just had a cheesecake. Well, that's a lot of fat. Your gallbladder is going to release a bunch of that bile so that you can emulsify the fats in that cheesecake so that you're going to be able to chemically digest those fats a little bit later on. A lot of people end up needing gallbladder surgery as they get older. What that does is doesn't affect the liver's ability to produce bile, but it does affect your ability to release a bunch of it at once. And so if you've had your gallbladder removed and then you eat a slice of cheesecake, you're going to regret that because you can't emulsify the fats in that cheesecake and it's going to go straight through you. So you'll have, okay, here's where I'm going to give you a really gross story. Oh my God, it was probably like 20 years ago at this point. Frito-Lay's made this product. It was a potato chip that had been fried in an oil called Olestra. They made it as a supposedly healthier version of potato chips. And so it still gets fried in oil, but Olestra, the oil, cannot be absorbed by people. What that means is people would suffer from, and they had to put this on the packaging, which is why you can't find these chips anymore. You may suffer from anal leakage. What that means is the fat goes right through you and you poo fatty diarrhea into your underwear or wherever you happen to be when that happens. So that's what can happen to a person who's had gallbladder surgery. The fats go right through them, they get diarrhea, and it's an oily diarrhea because they couldn't absorb the fats that were in there. Large intestine. Large intestine is also known as the colon, so exact same thing. Large intestine has your normal flora in it, which is all the bacteria that live in your large intestine, which there's hundreds of species that live in your large intestine. It absorbs water from your feces. So again, the longer the feces stays in there, the more water you absorb from it, and the harder and more compact your feces will become. It can absorb some nutrients, but honestly, most of it's already been absorbed by the time we make it to the large intestine. What I always close this particular section of notes with is, depending on your family history and things, when you hit either 50, 55, or 60, you are supposed to go in for a colonoscopy. Colonoscopy is essentially, we're going to stick a camera up your butt and we're going to look inside your colon, which I've never met a person that was like, oh my God, that sounds like a good Tuesday. So nobody wants to go get it done. What I can tell you is the worst part about the colonoscopy is actually the day before, because the day before you have to take a butt ton of laxative and you're going to live on the toilet the night before you go because they need your intestines to be really clean so they can see the walls really well. Then you go in for your colonoscopy, and in America, they knock you out for it. So you're not even essentially present in the room when the camera is going up your bum. You're not uncomfortable, you're asleep. What they're looking for are herniations, which are indentations in the colon, or polyps, which are growths out from the colon. If they find either of those two things, it means you are more at risk of specific conditions that happen. Most notably, if you have a polyp, which is a growth, that dramatically increases your risk of getting colon cancer. Now, if you go in for your colonoscopy when you're supposed to, they catch a polyp, they will actually remove it at the time they're doing the colonoscopy, and you won't know any different when you wake up until they tell you, hey, we found some polyps, we removed it. If you don't go get a colonoscopy, though, until you're starting to show symptoms that there's something wrong, like blood in your stool or very painful stools or anything along those lines, what will have happened is that polyp that would have been so easy to remove if you had just gone in sooner, it has grown and it has spread. And as a result, we have now had to take out a foot of your colon instead of just a little teeny tiny polyp that had been in your large intestine. Now, here's the problem with I have to remove a foot of your colon. If we do this, that cannot just be attached to this as is. So you are now pooping out of a hole in your abdomen. It's called a colostomy when that happens. And we basically get these special bags that are sort of Ziploc bags that we attach to a stoma. and you're pooping into that bag in your abdomen for the rest of your life. So essentially my question for you is, would you rather spend a night on a toilet that is unpleasant, or would you rather spend the rest of your life pooping out of your abdomen into a little bag? And I think most people, at least based on past experience, most of my students say a night on the toilet's not as bad as a bag for the rest of your life. So when you get old enough, please make sure you're getting colonoscopies or whatever they're doing at that time, because I'm sure for a lot of you that's a long way away. But for your parents, make sure they know they should be going in for colonoscopies so that we can save, lives. If the polyp grows and we have to remove it and it has spread, that's colon cancer. And colon cancer is on the rise because the American diet is crap at this point. And so that has increased our risk of colon cancer, and it's increased the death rate for colon cancer. So just please go get your colonoscopy when you're supposed to. I think that's where I stopped, but just in case I didn't, maybe I'm supposed to talk about hemorrhoids before I get there. I'm trying to look, sorry. Large intestine. Nope, tooth decay is what you guys have next. So that's where I was going to stop this video. Hope that helps.